Good evening, all. Tonight we are discussing the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. His summative quotation is, "Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." So what I ask you to read is the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, which is sometimes also called the foundation of the metaphysics of morals, and that's a quiz question. This is one of the single most important books in Western moral philosophy, and you read a pretty good chunk of it. It's not a very long book. And what he's trying to do is find the supreme principle of morality. So the concepts here of necessity and universality are especially important for us to grasp. We're subject to duties that apply with necessity and universality. A duty is a requirement. It's a practical law for us because we are rational beings. Kant is looking for something that will apply to every rational being, no matter who they are, where they are, when they are, and so forth. So duties, on Kant's account, are going to override any other kinds of reasons we might have. So let's look at it from an if-then statement. If we're morally bound to tell the truth in a given situation, and you can see that Kant's kind of obsessed with telling the truth, then we must tell the truth, whether we want to or not, whether it serves our interests or not, whether it harms us, benefits us, whatever, it doesn't matter. As far as the universality thing, we're looking for universally valid principles, which means exactly what it sounds like, that everyone, everywhere, all the time in this situation would have to do the exact same thing. So if these moral requirements really apply this way, they can't be based in features of human nature and human psychology, which you'll recall is kind of what David Hume thought. Rather, they've got to have an a priori or prior to experience basis in reason. Okay, so our first key concept for Kant is the idea of the good will, okay? This is a disposition. We're favorably disposed to act on our judgment of what's morally right, or basically we do the right thing simply because it's the right thing to do, which kind of leads into moral worth. An action carries with it moral worth, this special value that elicits our esteem, our liking it, our approving of it, only when it's done from duty. That is, when we're moved by the recognition the action is morally right. Now, if you listen to some of this language, our esteem, moved, disposition, he's using a lot of very emotive language, such as we might have seen in Hobbes and we definitely saw in Hume, to tell us that we ought not to be too emotional or passionate, but rather that we ought to be rational. And then the big one is going to be imperative. Remember, the big difference there is between suggestive, which says should, and imperative, which uses ought, okay? We can tell imperatives because they use ought. By an imperative, he means a principle or conclusion about what we have a reason to do. And he's going to subdistinguish between hypothetical and categorical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative, we're choosing it as a means to an end. We might say we're choosing consequentially, or we're choosing teleologically. Remember, telos, end, aim, plan, goal, design, outcome, and so on. And a categorical imperative says an action is good regardless of what we desire, no matter what end or consequences we're seeking to get. The categorical imperative, he says, this is it. This is the fundamental groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. Metaphysics, remember, just beyond the physical. So thinking about our morality, this is what it's based on. And he gives two distinct formulations of this. One talks about acting on maxims. A maxim, not just a men's magazine, but also a subjective principle of action that can be rationally willed as a universal law. Another has to do with respecting humanity and rational nature, which is the same thing, as an end in and of itself. As far as what we mean by that, humanity as an end in itself, he means we've got a pretty impressive capacity for rational choice, and it's unique to us. My German Shepherd outside doesn't have it, my cat doesn't have it, only we've got it, okay? That's a capacity that's always to be respected. It sets limits on what we can do and how we can act, and it also gives us a pretty good basis of our obligations. Let's see. Kant is going to start out of the gates by telling us that nothing in the world, nothing even beyond the world, is he talking about God? Is he talking about aliens? He's kind of just eliminating all possibilities. He's giving us a very conclusive, very inclusive statement saying that nothing is good without qualification. That is, we don't have to argue on its behalf, except the goodwill. In fact, if you're going to be happy at all, you have to have this. Some virtues, some qualities are conducive to it. Literally, they conduct you, they lead you to it, and they can facilitate it, but they don't have any intrinsic unconditional worth. So Having generosity without goodwill, Kant says, isn't really a good thing. They seem to presuppose a goodwill, but limitations on them keep them from being absolutely good. Now, what makes it good? Not because of what it gets done, not because of what it accomplishes, not because it achieves an end. It is good only because of its willing, i.e. it est, that is to say, in other words, it is good in and of itself. Now, reason then, on Hume's account, if you recall, isn't enough to guide us to our needs. What reason does on Kant's account is create a good will in and of itself. So we're looking for the highest good still. It's a duty, for instance, to preserve our life, and to secure our happiness is a duty. And so let's look at an if-then statement. If the universal inclination to happiness didn't determine our will, and if health weren't at least a necessary factor for us in these calculations, then there would still remain, as in all other cases, some kind of law, Kant's very big on laws, that we ought to promote our happiness, not from inclination, but from duty. And only that law would our conduct have true moral worth. Okay, so he's going to make a couple of propositions here. The first one is this: to have moral worth, an action must be done from duty or obligation. That's criteria number one. Criteria number two: an action done from duty doesn't have its moral worth in the purpose achieved, but in the maxim by which it's determined. So let us say on Kant's account, if I'm doing the right thing, but I'm doing it because I seek a specific end, well, then it's not the right thing because I'm too focused on the outcome. He wants me to focus on the maxim. So the moral value doesn't depend on the reality of the object of the action. So let's say that you have created a maxim for yourself that if you see a building on fire, you'll always run in and pull out whoever you can save. And so you pass a building, it's on fire, you run in there, you grab the person, he's resisting, he's really struggling against you, and yet you drag him out to the street. And when you get out there, he's fully clothed as a fireman. He says, "Let go of me, I'm trying to do my job." Kant would say that you were still doing the right thing because ultimately you were trying to live up to your maximum, save someone in danger, even though it was absolutely the wrong thing and got a bad consequence from it. So where Kant is going to place us is at a crossroads. He'll say we're between an a priori principle, which is formal, that means it exists as an idea only, a priori, prior to experience, and an a posteriori incentive, which is material, it's actual, it's something that we want. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that might work out. So let's say, for example, that you said that you would never ever kill anyone. That would be your a priori principle. But now you find yourself with someone trying to kill you, and if you don't kill them, you're going to get killed. That would be your a posteriori incentive. We could say instead that you said you would never steal, a priori principle. But now your family's starving and you have to steal to help them survive, a posteriori incentive. And so on and so forth. So he says our actions have to be determined by something. If we're determining it from duty, it ought to be basically determined by this formal principle. Now, here's the problem. Kant would say that, well, if we said we would never kill or never steal, and we find ourselves in those situations, we either have to stand there and take it, or we have to go home and have a very frank conversation with our family about their impending starvation. So it's not really a great take on this, or at least it's probably not the best way to look at this in terms of practical applicability. Now he says duty is the necessity of an action done from respect of the law. The law itself is an object of respect, and thus it forms a command. So basically, even when I do something nice for you from a Kantian perspective, I'm not doing it for you, I'm doing it to demonstrate my respect of the law. And so that might ring a little hollow with those of us who want to think that we're actually being benefited to be personally benefited. So here's kind of where Kant's coming from. He says, an act of duty completely excludes the influence of my inclinations. In other words, it ignores what I want. It doesn't care. And so I can behave objectively instead of subjectively. And this subjective part, he says, is the maxim that I should follow the law even if it thwarts all my inclinations. Because the moral worth of an action isn't in the effect that's expected from it. It's just in the thing that is actually being done. So the only way you can do this is by making no exceptions. In a lot of ways, Kant is the anti-Sir Mix-a-Lot because he does not, in fact, like big buts. He wants no buts to apply. There cannot be any exceptions, no special circumstances, no without qualification, time made just this once. And so he's going to tell us that respect is regarded as the effect of the law on us as the subject. And everything moral that we do shows that respect for the law. So he comes up with the first iteration, the first version of the categorical imperative. I should never act in such a way that I could not that I could not will that my maxim should be a universal law. But he immediately thereafter says, already stating the maxim in that way shows that he's got this apprehensive concern for consequences. He's still thinking about what might happen, and that for his own theory is unacceptable. Now, you noticed in the reading that he's really, really obsessed with telling the truth and not lying. But he says, even when we're telling the truth, we've got to be careful, because if we're telling the truth from duty, it's because the concept of the action itself, telling the truth, contains a law for me. What if we're telling the truth out of a fear of disadvantageous consequences? That is, we're telling the truth because we don't want something bad to happen. He said, nope, can't do it that way because you're too obsessed with the outcome. And even if you lie, you justify the lie, but you can't will a universal law to lie. So your maxim destroys itself as soon as it's made if you go, well, everybody should lie. Well, no, they shouldn't. So Kant tells us something that's really kind of revealing. He says, inexperienced in the course of the world, incapable of being prepared for all its contingencies, I can ask only myself, can I will that my maxim become a universal law? Now, when he says he's inexperienced in the course of the world, he's not kidding. Okay, Kant was born in, grew up in, worked in, retired in, and died in Königsberg, Prussia, which today is a part of Germany. He never went more than 5 miles from home, so near as we can tell, doesn't seem to have had too many close personal friends, never married. So he really is inexperienced in the course of the world. And, you know, that's kind of one of those criticisms of the ivory tower academic, is it's hard to say if he had actually gone a bit further, whether he would have had a more well-rounded philosophy. But he says, look, if I can't make this maxim, I've got to reject my theory, not because it's bad for me, but because it can't be a principle of universal legislation. So to duty, every other motive has to give place, because duty is the condition of a will good in itself. And he says wisdom consists more in acting than in knowing, just to give some permanence to its ideas. What reason does, says Kant, is it gives us inexorable commands without promising anything to our inclinations. So let's do a little Latin etymology, shall we? Inexorable, something is orable if you can talk about it. You can orate. Ex means out of, in negates it. So if it's inexorable, you can't talk your way out of it, basically. You have no way to convince yourself that it's true. Now, I don't know about you, but my reason is capable of convincing me of things all the time. So Kant is probably doing either a little wishful thinking, or he's much more reasonable than the rest of us. Now, it says only a rational being has this capacity of acting according to a conception of laws, according to principles. This is what Aristotle had called epistemonikon. Remember that special feature of our rationality that, one, makes us fit for the rule of law, and two, allows us to see universal laws in particular instances. So what the will is here is choosing that only which reason, apart from our inclination, says is practically necessary for all, that is to say, for good. Now, the will is subjugated to these subjective conditions. In other words, we want what we want for our own purposes. And it doesn't always agree with objective conditions, that is, with what needs to be done in the situation. So our actions that are objectively necessary, that have to happen out there, are subjectively contingent, dependent on us. So what we get here is an objective principle that's constraining the will. It's kind of holding it back from what it wants, and that's going to be that imperative. Imperatives are always going to be expressed with an ought, and they indicate the relation of the objective law to the subjective constitution that's determined by the law and the will. Now, imperative, it's a formula. That's all it is, expressing a relation of objective laws of volition, of choice, to a subjective imperfection of the will. That is, a human will. We might choose to do good things, we might choose to do bad things. The imperative is what Kant says ought to guide us either way. So if an action's only good as a means to something else, well, then the imperative's hypothetical. So once again, you're taking this class to get the grade, to get the degree, to get the job, to get the money, to get the whatever you buy with the money. Those are hypothetical imperatives, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. But he says we ought to be chasing these categorical imperatives. Hypothetical, they're only good if the action is good to some purpose, possible or actual. Dental care is predicated on a hypothetical imperative. We go to the dentist so we have nice teeth. Now, what if those teeth get knocked out, fall out, whatever? Well, then we've wasted all that time in the dentist chair and we should have just been eating sugar by the bag. Categorical imperative says, I don't care what the outcome is. This is right simply because it's right to do. So we're still after happiness in a way, says Kant, but in a little bit different way. We're after that imperative morality, and it's unconditional and objective and universally valid. Categorical imperatives really aren't restricted by any kind of condition. We don't need to support them with evidence. We don't need to argue that they're good. But there are multiple types of imperatives. First, there are technical imperatives. These are things like art. When we say art, we mean closer to the Greek word technique, where we get technique, technical, and all that kind of from. So these are like, these materials are able to support this much weight, these materials will hold up to this, etc. Pragmatic imperatives belong to welfare. We do this because it's what works. Moral imperatives, this is what we're interested in from Kant. So he says the only question that really needs an answer is an imperative of morality possible? So the categorical imperative, he says, is a practical law, and he says there's only one version, and here's his final version. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. And so Kant's going to give some cases in the groundwork, and he's outlining these 4 possible cases to highlight how a decision might be carried out with respect of duty. Case 1 involves things that are contrary to our duty, such as stealing. Okay? Case 2, actions that are dutiful, but the only reason we really do them is because we fear the penalty or the consequences, like paying taxes. Nobody likes paying taxes, and yet we know that if we don't pay them, we go to federal prison. Case 3, these are things that go along with duty, but we're already inclined to do them because we enjoy them. So for me, providing these lectures for you, I'd much prefer that they were in person, but here we are. This is a duty, it is my job, and yet at the same time, I really enjoy it. So it's a labor of love. Case 4, this is where a lot of people tend to part company with Kant because it is kind of contentious. This is things that go along with our duty, but they're contrary to our inclinations, such as not committing suicide despite being in unbearable distress. Okay? Now, all of these duties, if we observe ourselves in any transgression of a duty, we find we don't actually will that our maxim should become a universal law. In other words, we might let ourselves off the hook, but we don't want everybody else doing that too. So where does this leave us? The question becomes one of this. Is it a necessary law for all rational beings that they should always judge their actions by such maxims and that they themselves could serve as universal laws? So Kant really is not kidding. He wants you to go around everywhere you go, and everything you do, ask, could you, by your will, that maxim become a universal law? In other words, that every other person in every other place, every other time, in the same situation, would have to do exactly what you did, whatever that happens to be. So we get this distinction arising between subjective ends, which rest on incentives, what we want, and objective ends, which depend on motives that ought to be, maybe aren't, but ought to be valid for every rational being. Now, we've got to find a way to think about this. And so he gives us also a practical imperative. It says, act so that you treat all humanity, whether in your own person or that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. Okay. And he's going to give us some examples there. He says, what if you're sick of life and contemplating suicide? Well, the problem is you could abuse that. And so you don't necessarily want to use that line of argumentation. What if you make a false promise to pay or secure a loan that you have no intention of repaying, like student loans? What if you don't wish to pursue a special talent that might benefit society? So what if you're, I don't know, you've got gifted hands, but rather than become a neurosurgeon, you decide to be a concert pianist or a chair masseuse? Kant says maybe you shouldn't be allowed to do that. I kind of part company with Kant on that. What if you're financially secure, but you don't donate to charity? Kant would say that is bad also. Really, the idea that we want to get out of this is the autonomy of the will. Auto means self. Nomos means law. So if you are autonomous, you are self-guided, self-lawed, self-ruled, self-governed. and so on and so forth. And what are those laws? The laws are the ones that you're giving yourself through these maxims. Rational beings belong to a realm of ends. He sometimes calls it a kingdom of ends. As a member, when he gives universal laws, but also when you're subject to those laws. So this is something, remember, that came up with Hobbes. Said, look, if you give the laws, but you don't follow them, you're seeking destruction of yourself in probably nasty kinds of means. The rational being is legislative, writing laws, in a realm of ends through the freedom of will, not only as a subject, but also as a sovereign, okay? So he says morality consists in the relation of every action of that legislation through which this realm of ends is possible. Okay, so final thoughts on this. Morality, he tells us, is in the relation of every action to that legislation through which a realm of ends is possible. What does he mean? What does he mean by this? In the realm of ends, everything is going to be divided. For Kant, everything either has a dignity or a price. Whatever has a price can be replaced by something else that's its equivalent. So if you lose your bike, you can buy a new bike, okay? Whatever is above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. So on Kant's account, morality and humanity both alone have dignity. So you can't buy morals and you can't buy a person, okay? Now, autonomy then, he says, that's the basis of both of these, the dignity of both human nature and every rational nature. Now, what do we think about Kant? I wish Kant were right. I want Kant to be true. Kant is very black and white, and in a perfect world, we would all be Kantians, but then none of us would need to have this discussion. So Kant leaves us a little bit of frustration, perhaps, in some of these that just don't quite make sense all the way. But it is good to read through these, and it does set up very nicely who we are looking at for next week, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. As always, if you've got comments or questions, place them down in the comments or post them in the discussion, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.